So you probably have been hearing or listening on this show to a lot of tariff news, and we can't help but talk about the island that is populated only by penguins, the herd of McDonald Island. It's just a great anecdote in this entire saga. But there's an island that's populated not only but largely by penguins, but also a lot of sheep. It is, perhaps you remember it from news of the early 80s, the Falkland Islands. And I was contacted by a former minister from the Falkland Islands, the chief economist of the Falkland Islands government. He is Michael Harte. He is now a professor at at Oregon State University. And I just got to ask him everything about trade wars, the Falklands, and, the penguin to sheep ratio, all of it. Welcome to The Gist, Professor Harte, as they said on the paper chase.
Thanks very much, Mike. And I should say that I wasn't a minister.
Not a minister.
Not a minister. That's an elected position of the British government. But yeah.
So when did you serve as chief economist for the Falklands?
Yeah, that was back about 20 years ago, from about 2001 to 2005. And since that time, I've spent my time providing advice to the private sector there, to industry, the fishing industry. So I've been heavily involved with the Falklands for about 25 years now.
Now, Falklands has 3,000 or so inhabitants?
I think the last census was 3,670.
Yeah. But like when you're in Oregon for half the time, it's 3,669. I mean, that's how sensitive they are.
Yeah, something like that. People go overseas a lot, yeah.
So is the chief economist also have to serve as, the chief milkman and scorekeeper and soccer and all those other jobs?
Not quite. You actually get to do a lot of things while you're down there in the public service, and the roles change over time, of course. And I think my official title is economic advisor and head of policy and planning. And so, yeah, you get involved in a lot of things you wouldn't normally expect to be involved in a larger country.
What is trade policy like in general in the Falklands?
Yeah, the Falklands are part of the international economy. We export about $350 million worth of products to the rest of the world, and import about, I think, 175 million. So so probably about twice as many exports as imports, and we're dependent upon trade to survive.
Because it is about 500 miles off the coast of Argentina, but Patagonia, so even South Argentina, right?
Yeah, so you head all the way down to the bottom of South America, hang a left, and you go about 300 miles off the coast, about an hour by flight, and you end up in the Falkland Islands.
Give me a sense of what the major exports are and what the major imports are.
Yeah, all the major exports are basically fish, of different types, squid and Patagonian toothfish, Chilean sea bass, to the rest of the world, mainly to Europe, some to to the US. And the main imports are oil for the housing and cars and things like that, and then a whole range of other, kit set houses to build homes and things like that. So the sort of things you expect a small island to be imported from the rest of the world, and most of that comes from the UK.
Is there wood on the Falklands?
Nope, there are no forests on the Falkland Islands. No, it's a very treeless place, grasslands all the way as far as the eye can see.
So you need lumber. You need all sort of building material.
Oh yeah, all the building material comes from overseas, and for a long time, before the Panama Canal was built, ships would come around the Cape Horn there. They would get wrecked in the big storms, and they would pull into the Falklands for repairs. Then they would be condemned by the local authorities, and they would use the cargo on board the vessels to build the houses and the warehouses and things like that.
Wait,
so very smart. Yeah, very smart.
Were the Falklanders setting up traps? Yeah. Were they like, oh, damn, another shipwreck?
Oh, damn, another shipwreck. That's right. Another warehouse for the for the town. Yeah.
So I would assume that as dependent as the Falklands are on imports, unlike a country like Bangladesh or some of these countries which have a lot of trade barriers, I would assume the more free trade, the better for the Falklands?
Yeah, most definitely. I mean, that's what the Falklands thrive on and need is effectively free trade. And tariff barriers and other trade barriers, really threaten the livelihoods and the future of the economy.
So I don't understand then, when I looked at the list of tariffs, what was the Falkland being tariffed at on Independence Day?
I was at 42%, I believe.
This is among the highest in the world.
Among the highest in the world.
Slightly under Lesotho.
It's quite an honor. We're winning so much, we had to be tariffs that highly, So, yeah. So I think, what it comes down to is I think we export something like about 10% of our exports go to the US. I think last time, 2023, last figures I have, about $27 million of exports to the US, and there was about $350,000 worth of imports. So there's a huge trade deficit with the US, and from the US perspective, and that led to the very, very high tariffs. Yeah.
But all the calculation was based on was this trade deficit. Now, as an economist, just give me a second or two, a précis on the wisdom of that as a way to calculate a tariff.
I took many economic classes. I even stayed awake in some of them way back when. And
you were the chief economist of a country. Come on.
And I think and I think that would be for any of us who studied economics and practiced economists, that would not be the way to calculate a tariff. Tariffs at best are used to create equal ground where there's unfair practices going on. So, for example, another country tariffs you, so you tariff them to try and equate it. But, I also, probably tell from the accent, a New Zealander, and, in the 80s, New Zealand went through a period of opening up its economy, eliminating subsidies, eliminating tariffs, and, one of the larger proponents of free trade, because it's the way small economies thrive, by trading with the rest of the world in the absence of barriers.
Right. And so when one does calculate it based on just trade deficit, what sort of mistakes may be made, or not even unintended consequence? I'm thinking, I've heard some examples, but maybe you could fill us in on the idea that if that's your calculation, you're necessarily going to make the following mistake. Not just that it won't be a great or well-calculated tariff, but what you're going to be doing is what? Guaranteeing what?
You're basically going to guarantee the collapse of international trade by doing it that way, because tariffs are so high. It's very hard for countries to adjust, and they make no sense. I mean, so in one sense, if you look at the Falklands, the price of their seafood in the US goes up by 42%. So your restaurant bill goes up by the price by a significant proportion because of that. And the US will simply buy its toothfish from Chile, which is taxed at 10% or a lower rate, and so it's distortionary. And there is nothing that a small country like the Falklands or the SOSO can do about that. They're not in a position to negotiate with with this administration.
Right. And let's also make clear, the Falklands have no or almost no actual tariffs or barriers for the United States goods. I mean, if that were the case, you could understand some sort of tit for tariff, but there are no barriers for the Falklands. It wouldn't make sense for them to have barriers for incoming goods.
Yeah, I mean, the Falklands have some import tariffs, duties, I assume, on imports as a small country as a way of raising income, but they're certainly not massive. And I think the trade with the US is $323,000, which I think is partly airplane parts, computers, and a few other things like that. So, the reciprocal reciprocity there is just orders of magnitude different.
Yeah, it just would seem that as a market, it's not even on the United States radar. But of course, from the Falklands perspective, the United States, I'm sure Argentina is the number one trade partner, but the United States has to be not close behind. It's dominant. Yeah,
so the United States is about fourth. So the largest is actually, if you look at it, is Spain by a large proportion. It's a couple of $100 million worth of exports in fish, and the exports to the US are about 10% of that. And so most of the trade is actually with Spain and other countries where we send the seafood products to. Actually, very little with the UK. And most imports are from the United Kingdom, but most of the exports are actually to Spain, which is our main trading partners. We actually do not trade with Argentina. There's actually a very active embargo against the Falklands by Argentina that creates things to be makes things quite challenging for the Falklands at times because of that tension between the United Kingdom and the Argentina over the sovereignty. So that's another factor that creates some issues for the future of the Falklands and their own ability to feel confidence in their place in the world.
Yeah, forgot about that little thing.
Yeah, that little conflict there. Yeah, that little conflict there. Yeah.
So, are you in touch with the government or people in the government or people who maybe have your old job in the economics department at the Falklands? Yeah,
I'm in touch with the fishing industry down there and the private sector all the time. I'm part of the South Atlantic Environmental Research Institute, a senior fellow there, and work very closely with the private sector and the fishing industry on a number of different projects. I know the chief executive of the government, Andrea Clausen, who's the chief, I guess the chief bureaucrat in the Falklands, although I'm sure Andrew would not like that title. And we talk about these things all the time, and we talk about the place of the Falklands in the world and what policies will keep the Falklands thriving. I mean, it's one of the few places in the world that has no debt. It has a surplus for the government. The government brings in more money than it spends. It has a taxation system that is basically fair and generally flat, and it's a very successful country. So we talk about things that are going to disrupt that economy in the future all the time.
Wow. So I would imagine the Trump administration has bragged about we have 75 countries already who've called. I would imagine a very small country like the Falklands, it would be hard to even get an official on the phone. Even if President Trump is happy that this quote unquote brought South Korea to the negotiating table, as if, just a request wouldn't bring South Korea or other countries to negotiate with the behemoth that is the United States. What about the Falklands? It has to wait in line behind a lot of people while suffering from gigantic tariffs, right?
Yeah, I mean, most definitely. In fact, the Falklands aren't able to actually speak directly to the US on their own. I mean, they're an overseas territory of the United Kingdom. So although they're self-governing in many respects, they're actually, the United Kingdom speaks for them on behalf of on issues of international trade.
So this is what this discussion is between you and I, Michael. We'll each be cutouts for our respective land.
Exactly.
I'll take it up the chain of command to Howard, and you talk to your bureaucrat there in the Falklands.
Exactly, and that's the way it works. But I was there last year. I was there this time last year in the Falklands and doing some work down there. And there was a delegation of U.S. Congress people there, their staffers. And they spent a lot of time talking to people in the Falklands. So it's not as if the Falklands, the U.S. isn't aware of the Falkland Islands. And I'm sure they had a very good trip down there and very well treated and saw a lot of penguins,
Yeah, I'm sure as an economics expert, you're with the vast, vast, vast majority who look askance at tariffs, except for very limited reasons. But what about the overall issue of this is probably apart from your expertise with the Falklands, but what about the overall issue of if international trade and the way the U.S. has gone about international trade over the last 20, 30 years has been a policy in error, if not a failed policy? What do you think of that?
Yeah. You have to look at it's challenging. There's the whole issue. What would have occurred in the absence of free trade? Would we still have a dynamic, textile sector in the US? Or would those jobs moved on? Would they become automated? Would they be replaced? So it's very hard to look at those impacts. But generally, I think every one of us who's an economist would generally say that free trade, lack of tariffs, open borders for trading goods is a good thing overall. It allows countries to thrive in what they do well and allow other countries to export what they do well as well. I think the big, the issue that many of us would look at is not just goods and services. It's not just the goods that are exported or imported. It's also the services. And countries like the US have massive, trade gains in terms of services, in terms of what the US exports to the rest of the world in terms of services. So just looking at goods by themselves doesn't make any sense to us as economists. You need to look at the total picture and where everything bounces out in the world. And you would expect a country with a small proportion of the population, but with a very large economy, to be important from the rest of the world. It's not a bad thing.
Yeah. Now, I just want to ask you a couple of personal questions or familial questions. How did you come to be associated with the Falklands? You're a Kiwi?
Yeah, I was a Kiwi. Yeah, many, many years ago.
I understand. I guess you have a life quest. Okay, I can go to Oregon. I'm going to go the furthest I could possibly go. First the Falklands, then Oregon. But you take me through it. Yeah.
So I was sitting there, and I was working at the time for the New Zealand fish industry. I was their head of policy and science for the national body that sort of coordinated issues for the matters for the fishing industry. And I was gone through a period of quite significant reforms in the industry and looking for my next opportunity. And I was reading through the Economist magazine, and in those things in the old days we had paper magazines, and flicking through the want ads in the back, and they said, "Hey, we're looking for an economist who knows something about fisheries." And I go, "Wow! So how could I? What would be the next part of an adventure to a place that sounded exciting and interesting, in a place where you could be a big fish in a small sea, really, and actually have a chance to make a difference?" And they don't come up very often.
Yeah. And what year was this?
This was back in 2001, so probably 2000, yeah.
So you're 20 years past the war, and it is how far from New Zealand to the Falklands, and how do you get there by flight?
Oh, well, yeah. So the easy to get, so distances might be incorrect, but I think it's about 8,000 miles. You fly from New Zealand to Chile across the Pacific there, and then fly from Chile down to the Falkland Islands. That flight goes once a week on a Saturday. From Chile.
I didn't know they had a Christchurch to Santiago direct.
Yeah, it's an Auckland, Santiago. Yeah, that's right. Yeah,
it's Auckland,
right. Auckland to Santiago, and then Santiago to the Falklands.
And you lived there, and you wed there, and you started a family there.
I had a family there. I went there. I went there with my ex-wife, and she stayed, and my three of my children stayed down there, and they've thrived and prospered. The Falklands are a wonderful place. They provide free schooling, and they fund people to go to university if they make the grades in their high school exams, and they even fund some people going to graduate school. So it's a great place to. It's a great place to grow up and have a family, and
this is better than an ad in The Economist. Is there a sovereign wealth fund? What, besides access to a lot of penguins and sheep, what do your kids get as Falkland? What would be the demonym? Falklanders?
Yeah, Falkland Islanders. Yeah, they get free healthcare, free schooling. There's a child allowance of about $100 a month per child for children under 16. They get their university paid for, and they're training overseas. There's full employment. They get to be what kids do everywhere. They do need to leave to finish their high schools. You can do high school up to about grade 10 there, then you finish your last 2 years overseas, and that can be challenging for students to leave a small country and move to the UK or other countries to do their education. But yeah, it's a great place, and thriving restaurant scene, And
how many restaurants?
Oh,
7?
I'd have to add up. I think last time I counted, there were probably 7 or 8 restaurants in this place like this. And for a town of 3,000 people, you have a great choice of bars and restaurants. There's a karaoke lounge there that does cocktails.
Karaoke lounge.
Yeah. So
Is the feel very much of the Commonwealth, an English place, English speaking, mostly like things that you were familiar with growing up in New Zealand?
Yeah, very much so. I mean, when my parents were alive and they visited, they said this is like they were from the UK, and they would say this is how the UK was in the 1950s. A very strong feeling for it, UK feeling. Having said that, about 48% of the population are born in the Falklands. Another 26% come from the UK, so that's 75% from the UK. Otherwise, a very cosmopolitan place with Saint Helenian people from the island of Saint Helena, Chileans, Filipinos. It's a very cosmopolitan place. Yeah.
Tell me about the sheep, because I remember during the war, the phrase "more sheep than people" it was practically obligatory to say that about the Falklands. And I know, of course, the flag has a sheep right there on the crest.
It certainly does. Yeah. So the Falklands are well known for their sheep farm and their export of wool, and
so they do export a lot of wool, not just fish.
No, they export about $4.6 million worth of wool. So it's very small compared to the fish exports, but all the way up until the conflict in '82, the Falklands were, based upon their rural economy. The people who lived in the main town were the second-class citizens. Everything was revolving around these farms that produced large amounts of wool that was sent to the UK for turning into carpets and clothing. And during that time, wool's become less important in a smaller part of the economy, and fishing and other sectors have become more important. But the farming sector and the sheep are still very much part of the Falkland Island identity, and many people would probably identify as farmers and with their agriculture than their fishing. So there's a wonderful story is that you've heard of the we talk about the wind chill factor, of course, when you're in New York on a cold winter day. Well, the Falklands on their radio broadcast a sheep chill factor. The sheep chill factor. So it's the risk of the weather to newborn lambs in the Falkland Islands, and it's broadcast on the radio every day. So I'm not sure anywhere else in the world does that, but it's called the sheep chill factor. Yeah.
That's fantastic. And so let's bring it back to the tariff and trade and the economy. Are they very worried there? More worried than even the average American is by a risk of recession at what these tariffs emanating from thousands of miles away might wreak?
Yeah. So, the tariffs would impact about 10% of the Falkland Islands exports, but a very important part of those exports, which is the Patagonian toothfish, a very important part of the local fishing industry. I think they're worried about the tariffs. They've been through tariffs before. They've been through Brexit. They've been through high tariffs in the EU as a result of other things, and they've weathered those and been very effective in advocating for themselves. I think the biggest threat to the Falklands is the overall disruption to the international trade and the international economy rather than the tariffs themselves. So it's those second-round effects. I think all things being equal, the Falkland Islands could weather and adopt strategies and which to limit their exposure to tariffs. But the overall disruption to international trade and the world economy as we know it, which is what we're looking at the moment, I think is frightening for a country that has very little say in those matters.
Michael Harte is a professor at Oregon State University, and he was, for a time, the chief economist of the Falklands and, of course, a reader of The Economist magazine. I'm giving them a free plug. Thank you so much, Michael.
Thank you much, Mike. It was great talking to you.